didn't suit him. They had decided to meet in Hamar. That was the best place, since 2 of them were coming from Simrishamn and the others from Ystad. They would drive out to the nature reserve, park their cars, and walk to the spot they had chosen. They had not been able to agree upon anything for a long time. They had discussed various alternatives and sent the proposals back and forth, but when one of them finally suggested this place, the others had quickly assented, perhaps because they had run out of time. One of them took care of the food, while another went to Copenhagen and rented the clothes and wigs that were needed. Nothing would be left to chance. They even took the possibility of bad weather into account. At 2 p.m. on Midsummer's Eve, one of them put a big tarpaulin in his red duffel bag. He also included a roll of tape and some old aluminum tent pegs. If it rained, they would have shelter. Everything was ready. There was only one thing that could not have been anticipated. One of them suddenly became ill. It was a young woman, the one who had perhaps been looking forward to the Midsummer's Eve plans most of all. She had met the others less than a year before. When she woke up that morning, she had felt nauseated. At first, she thought it was because she was nervous. But some hours later, when it was already midday, she had started vomiting and running a temperature. She still hoped it would pass, but when her lift arrived, she stood at the door on trembling legs and said that she was too ill to go. Consequently, there were only 3 of them in Hamar shortly before 7:30 p.m. on Midsummer's Eve. But they did not allow this to spoil the mood. They were experienced. They knew that these things happened. One could never guard against sudden illness. They parked outside the nature reserve, took their baskets, and disappeared down one of the paths. One of them thought he heard an accordion in the distance, but otherwise there were just birds and the distant sound of the sea. When they arrived at the selected spot, they knew at once that it had been the right choice. Here they would be undisturbed and free to await the dawn. The sky was now completely free of clouds. The midsummer night would be clear and beautiful. They had made the plans for Midsummer's Eve at the beginning of February, when they had spoken of their longing for light summer nights. They had drunk large quantities of wine and quarreled at length about the precise meaning of the word dusk. At what point did this particular moment between light and dark arrive? How could one really describe the landscape of twilight in words? How much could you actually still see when the light passed into this obscure state of transition, defined by a certain length of the shadows? They had not come to an agreement. The question of dusk had remained unsolved, but they had started planning their celebration that evening. They arrived at the hollow and put down their baskets, then separated and changed behind some thick bushes. They wedged small makeup mirrors in the branches so they could check that their wigs were on straight. None of them sensed the man who observed their careful preparations from a distance. Getting the wigs to sit straight turned out to be the easiest part. Putting on the corsets, padding, and petticoats was more difficult, as was arranging the cravat and the ruffles, not to mention applying the thick layers of powder. They wanted every detail to be perfect. They were playing a game, but the game was in earnest. At 8 p.m. they came out from behind their bushes and looked at each other. It was a breathtaking moment. Once more, they had left their own time for another age, the age of Bellman, the bacchanalian 18th-century poet. They drew closer and burst into laughter, but then they regained their composure. They spread out a large tablecloth, unpacked their baskets, and put on a tape with several renditions of the most famous songs from Bellman's work, Friedmann's Epistles. Then the celebration began. When winter comes, they said to each other, we will think back on this evening. They were creating yet another secret for themselves. At midnight he had still not made up his mind. He knew he had plenty of time. They would be staying until dawn. Perhaps they would even stay and sleep all morning. He knew their plans down to the last.